Jehovah's Witnesses seem to isolate this verse, Matthew 24, verse 5, and capture this expression, faithful and discreet slave, and then they insert the word class, and they make this application to them, in the Lord's day. What I've been trying to do is to de-isolate the verse, look at the context, and take this phrase, faithful and discreet slave, and really look at this. They really put the fear of God into this faithful and discreet slave. This group of words. If you took out the word discreet, the faithful slave, that's what you're left with. It loses its power in the Jehovah's Witness organization. So as stated before, Jehovah's Witnesses believe that Christ came and they have been rewarded for their faithfulness. See, it's so confusing because only Charles J. Russell was acting as faithful and discreet slave. So there was no class at 1914. But what I thought of when this idea is, there's a verse in Corinthians that talks about rulings as kings and priests already before Christ gives them their reward to rule in the future. So I tried to find this verse, and I'm going to read it to you because it uses the word discreet in here too, and Jehovah's Witnesses don't really use other verses in the Bible to complement Matthew 24 verse 45. They let it stand on its own. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 4. Apostle Paul, of course. Let a man so appraise us as being subordinates of Christ and stewards of sacred secrets of God. And it's interesting it says the word stewards because the account in Luke where Matthew 24 verse 45 is linked. Let me see if I want to read that to you. I should read that to you first. Give me a second here. GKL. Luke 12 verse 44. See, and that's another thing. I don't understand why Jehovah's Witnesses don't refer to Luke. Luke's account of Jesus saying these words, he says it slightly different, but they always refer to Matthew chapter 24 verse 45. Luke 12:44 says, and the Lord said, who really is the faithful steward, the discreet one, whom his master will appoint over his body of attendants, to keep giving them their measure of food supplies at the proper time? Happy is that slave, if his master on arriving finds him doing so. You see how he mixes up the words a little bit and puts in this word steward. But the words discreet and faithful, the same ideas are still there. But so Paul says, let us appraise us as being subordinates of Christ and stewards of sacred secrets of God. Besides, in this case, what is looked for in stewards is for a man to be found faithful and discreet. Now, to me, it is a very trivial matter that I should be examined by you or by a human tribunal. Even I do not examine myself, for I am not conscious of anything against myself. Yet by this I am not proved righteous, but he that examines me is Jehovah. Hence, do not judge anything before the due time. This is interesting. Until the Lord comes, right? You don't have the word present, you know. Until the Lord comes, who will bring both the secret things of darkness to light and make the counsels of the hearts manifest. And then each one will have his praise come to him from God. Again, you have this accounts that's Christ is settling when he comes. Is he talking about 1914, or is he talking about uh, the end? You know. Now, brothers, these things I have transferred so as to apply to myself and Apollos for your good, that in our case you may learn the rule: do not go beyond the things that are written, which is a very important thing for religions to do, not to be adding things in the Bible, putting words in there, changing, making it fit their own concepts, right? Don't go beyond the things that are written, in order that you may not be puffed up individually in favor of the one against the other. For who makes you to differ from another? Indeed, what do you have that you did not receive? If now you do not indeed receive it, why do you boast as though you did not receive it? And I thought this is the verse that came to my mind about them being rewarded in the Lord's day, and being appointed over all the belongings already. It says, but you men already have your fill, do you? You are rich already, are you? You have begun ruling as kings without us, have you? See, the Matthew 24 verse 45 says that he will appoint them over all his belongings. To me, it sounds like they've already begun ruling as lords here. It says, and I wish indeed that you had begun ruling as kings, that we might rule with you as kings. For it seems to me that God has put us, the apostles, last on exhibition, as men appointed to death, because we have become a theatrical spectacle to the world, and to angels and to men. And I thought this was interesting. We are fools because of Christ, but you are discreet in Christ. And so there's a reference of this word discreet. So I was wondering if they would take you to Matthew 24 verse 45, talking about faithful and discreet slave. It's a perfect opportunity. But they do not cross-reference it to Matthew 24 verse 45. It takes you to Matthew chapter 10 verse 16, which I will read to you. Jesus saying, look, I'm sending you forth as sheep amidst wolves. Therefore prove yourselves cautious as serpents, and yet innocent as doves. Be on your guard against men, for they will deliver you up to local courts, and they will scourge you in their synagogues. So it's saying to be cautious as serpent and innocent as doves, because they were Christians in a very vicious world. They were among wolves. They were going to be held on trial, and they had to be careful with. This is be cautious as serpents. So I looked up the word discreet in the dictionary. I'll read it to you. It says prudent and tactful in speech or behavior, restrained, a discreet servant, faithful and discreet slave. So it's prudent and tactful in speech was the first thing. Be careful what you say, or your behavior restrained. Self-control, right? A lawyer must be discreet and not violate the confidence of a client, showing prudence and tact, polite. The salesman maintained a discreet distance while they discussed their finances. So being very, very cautious, being very careful, being respectful of people's confidentiality. And the early Christians were told to be discreet, be careful with the message of Christ. Who really is a faithful and discreet slave? I'm going to read you another section here. I'm going to go back to the idea of slaves. And I also want to mention something I found very interesting. The only Bible books written after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE were written by John. And you know, John wrote the book of Revelation, Patmos. I have it here completed at around 96 CE. Okay, and John was old man, like I think he was 90 years old. I can't remember. But in fact, according to this chart by Jehovah's Witnesses, that Revelation was not the last book written, though it's placed last in the Bible. In fact, even the Bible book of John was written after Revelation, as well as 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, which they place about 2 years after Revelation. So I'm going to read to you the book of John. So you might want to imagine him in his 90s. After he's written Revelation, he's writing this book, recalling his account with Jesus Christ in incredible detail, really. I'm going to read John chapter 15, verses 11 to 15. And you can think of this illustration again, but not. He's not on the mountain, but he is, near his death, and he is preparing his disciples for life without him. Chapter 15, verse 11. These things I've spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and your joy may be made full. You can think of the verse where if they're faithful, they enter into the joy of their master. This wedding that awaits them as being a bride of Christ. If they're faithful and discreet, they can enter into the joy of their master. This is my commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. No one has love greater than this, that someone should surrender his soul in behalf of his friends. Now, we're going back to the idea of slave. If Christ has purchased, this is actually before he's paid the purchase price. But the idea of being a slave, and God's view of how he treats his slaves. That someone should surrender his soul on behalf of his friends. You are my friends if you do what I'm commanding you. I no longer call you slaves, because a slave does not know what his master does. That's interesting. A slave does not know what his master does. I mean, if you think about the definition of a slave, is because we are the property of Christ. So in one sense, we'll always, as far as I understand, we'll always be a slave of God and Christ. We're always their property. But he's saying, I no longer call you slaves, because a slave does not know what his master does, but I've called you friends, because all the things I've heard from my Father I have made known to you. Um, so I thought that was interesting that see it's kind of a strange concept when the faithful and discreet slave, the way Jehovah's Witnesses use this term and these words, is that Christ has, if you're not following the rules, they say you're not respecting Jehovah's arrangement, you're not following the faithful and discreet slave class or slave. Isn't it ironic that a slave is ruling over you, right? We're all Christ's slaves, but um, you know, if you do what you're commanded by Christ, he calls you friends, right? When you are given your reward, you know, when he says, enter into the joy of your master, whatever, are they still called slaves? I mean, even Jesus, before he actually was crucified, was, you know, or even before the disciples proved true to their assignment, he's according them he said, I no longer call you slaves. I call you friends. If you do what I'm commanding you, you know. So, I mean, if Christ came back in 1914 and said, okay, you were a faithful slave, you were true to your assignment, I'm going to appoint you over all my belongings. I find this a little bit weird that they're still slaves. I mean, anyways, but that's just one uh, words are funny, right? Um, I have a few more. I'm gonna have to do another part here. I gotta collect a few more ideas, and this will be the last one. I think. All right.